Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Reardon, president of Connecticut Audubon Society, and welcome to this evening's program, The Plight of Our Birds, a Call to Action. Connecticut wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Gusset, Wepawag, Quinnipiac, Tucket, Nunkatuk, and Hamnasset people, as we advocate for the conservation of land and its wildlife. We're indebted to the work of native and indigenous people who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. A couple of upcoming events. Saturday at Urbanscapes Native Plant Nursery from uh, 10 to 1, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. We have our Fall All Things Pollinators Festival. Tuesday, November 25th, we're going to go birding in Italy. And then on Tuesday, December 9th, we'll meet the real James Bond, Birdman of Mystery. So our speakers tonight are Dr. Min Wong, research scientist at UConn and migratory bird leader at the Connecticut Department of Natural Resources and Environment, and Craig Rapaz. He's the founder of Lights Out Connecticut and president of the Friends of Stuart B. McKinney National Wildlife Refuge, among other things. He is a volunteer coordinator for the Bird Atlas. So with that, gentlemen, welcome.
Well, thank you all for putting up with us for the next hour or so. So our talk is kind of in tandem. Craig is going to start us off, and then we'll have a very brief transition, and I'll take it from there.
Great, thank you. So some of you were involved in the Atlas, but for me, it was late May 2018. The peak spring migration is pretty much sputtering out by then. I usually bird in the New Haven area and other well-known hotspots in the state, but this time I was birding in a new place called the Concoponcet State Forest. In the coming years, that would be known as my block, and I would love it dearly. This time, it was a different type of birding. I was slowing down to watch chickadees to see if they exhibited a certain behavior. I would watch a cedar waxwing, hoping it would fly away with a dragonfly. Instead of just ticking off species like I normally do, I had to stop and watch for breeding behavior. I was carrying an iPhone that was opened up to an eBird checklist, and I also had a mapping app on my iPhone. I was also carrying this scary document. This would be a great Halloween costume. This document shows when the species in Connecticut have stopped their migration and should be on breeding territory. These are safe dates. So I was hoping to watch breeding behavior so I could ignore this data because breeding behavior trumps the safe dates. So I would return again and again to this block until I tagged 20 hours. I wasn't the only one doing this. There were birders from all over the state that have adopted blocks, and they were birding in the same fashion I was and submitting their checklists. In fact, these are the names of the people who were adopters or submitted data. In fact, we had about 1,000 people that either adopted a block or they contributed data and reports in some form. Many of the volunteers covered multiple areas. Sometimes birders got together, like for example, the New Haven Bird Club went to Voluntown and out to Morris, Connecticut. These are places that we never bird. It's really far away from our usual haunts, but a small group of birders could go out and knock out this block and put in 20 hours and finish it off for the Atlas. But then we would do this all over again in the winter. Twice, in fact, we'd go out in early winter and then in late winter just to see what birds were there. We also had our blockbusting activity, so we would bird for a few hours, go warm up over a cup of coffee, and then go out and do it again. Why were we doing this? This was the Connecticut Bird Atlas data gathering phase. In addition to the thousands of volunteer I mentioned, there's also the Atlas team, which was headed up by Min Wong, Chris Elphick, Morgan Tingley. We also had Sam Merker and Raulerstein that did a lot of modeling. We had a team of undergrads that were entering data. We had field technicians, and very importantly, we also had regional coordinators for each area to help us as far as manage the volunteers. So, what is an atlas, and why do we do it? An atlas basically starts off with territory mapping, where you have an area, you mark where the birds are, where you see them nesting. Very important. You could track things over time, year after year, this way. But if it's just a meadow, but it could also include a town, and as you start to get more and more of these territory maps, you start to build an atlas. So atlases could be on the county level, it could be on the continent level. Some atlases mine data, historical data from the past, and see how there have been changes over time. So this one goes from 1875 to 1900, and the corncrake is not doing very well in the UK at all. So our atlas, we had our first one in 1982 to 1986, and this serves as a baseline. If you don't have another atlas, you really will not know the trends. It really is a historical who's who for birds and also birders. It's really kind of interesting to see who submitted data back then and if they're still around in the state birding. So at the time we got started, Massachusetts had finished their second atlas. Rhode Island was in the middle of theirs. Vermont had concluded, and Maine was just getting theirs kicked off. New York was on the brink of launching into their third atlas. So when all's said and done, we have a trophy. We have a bound volume that we put on our bookshelf. It takes up space, and really is a trophy. So what are we doing with the Connecticut Bird Atlas? It went from 2018 to 2022 for the data gathering stage. So yeah, we would baseline the bird populations, see where they're nesting, see what the changes are from the previous atlas. But more importantly, for tonight's conversation, the idea was to utilize the momentum and galvanize the conservation community to work together to develop a stable funding mechanism to better protect habitat and investigate other causes of decline. So that's where Min will pick up and talk to us about this particular aspect. So the mechanics, I don't know how many in this audience has done an atlas or was involved in this project, but just to get you familiar with what was happening, we divided the state into 601 blocks. They were both full and partial. So a partial block would be something along the coast or along the border with another state. It wasn't a full block. So how we determine a block, we take a US GS topo map and divide it into six. Like, for example, the Sharon quadrangle would be divided into six blocks, which would be Sharon A, B, C, D, E, and F. So we got this grid, as you see here. So this grid was put on the on our web page. This was the work of Dr. Tingley. So it had a lot of functionality to it. As you see, these are shaded by groups. This is where the regional coordinators came in. It would be somebody, Steve Broker in this area, who knew this area very well and also knew the birders. So it could match the birder to the territory that the birder knew pretty well, just using the talent and the knowledge as much as possible. So if you were to click on any one of these blocks, you would get a pop-up that would tell you what the name of the block is, if it was filled by an adopter, who the adopter was, if it was completed or not. When I say completed, meaning they have done 20 hours, how many birds have been confirmed breeding, etc. And if you keep clicking, you will actually pull up maps. maps to help you navigate and maps to help you determine where the habitat was and where the public lands were so you could cover every habitat group. Also a species list. So you would see what was recorded in that block in the 80 atlas and the current atlas, and also what was happening over winter. Also, many of us were carrying this Google Maps on our iPhone. We could track where we were, so we would not go off our boundary into another block, because that could help screw up the eBird checklist. So we were armed with a lot of technology. So again, the breeding survey, the idea was to spend up to 20 hours birding over 3 years, visit all habitats within the block, list all species seen, and try to record as much evidence as possible of breeding using standard codes. We need to explain why we have it set at 20 hours. We found that if you're in an area and you bird 20 hours, you pretty much are going to cover all the species that are there. Any further effort is going to be law of diminishing returns. So it's a matter of saying that block is complete and move on, just so all the blocks in the state would be covered. So the breeding codes went from observed and possible to probable to confirmed breeding. So if you saw a bird, let's say a wood thrush in the woods, that would be suitable habitat. Or if it was singing, it's possible breeding. But if you see a mated pair, if you see them doing territorial displays or courtship, like my waxwing, his dragonfly got shoved down another waxwing's beak. So that was courtship behavior. And then there's breeding. Confirmed. So it would be you see them on the nest or carrying food or taking care of the young, the fledglings that are obvious. So what did we get from this? We had 168 confirmed species in the state. That was down from 173 in the 1980s atlas. This atlas was different because we also had the winter surveys. The other atlases don't normally do this, but we thought we would need to see what's happening. So here again, 20 hours over 3 years, 10 hours in the beginning of winter and 10 hours in late winter. In addition to what the volunteers were doing, we had field technicians that were out doing these surveys as well, because what we found, a lot of birders actually go south themselves for the winter, and these blocks were orphaned and we needed to have the coverage. So there was a few individuals that really did an incredible task of going into other areas and putting a lot of hours into it. But what did we get from the Winter Atlas? We had a total of 247 species. So from November to December, we had 235, and then January to February, 199. This kind of shows you as the birds are settling into the winter season. So all told, we had over 45,000 checklists, and we had over 611,000 records. That's quite an effort put in. So really hats off to all the volunteers that contributed to this effort. So it all wasn't all rosy and glorious and all that. In the middle, we had a big epidemic. COVID struck, and the state was shut down. We did not want to have people driving around to their remote atlases, and it's just better that people stayed home and birded their backyard or something, really a walk away from where they were living. So we tacked on another year for the data gathering phase of this. Also, a paper came out in 2019 that really took a lot of us by surprise. It was a kick in the gut. I guess we really suspected that these trends were happening. This is the paper that stated that we were down close to 3 billion birds in North America from 1970 to the current time. So that's 1 in 4 birds. 90% of this loss came from just 12 bird families, including sparrows, warblers, finches, and swallows. And of course, we were asking the question, will our results in Connecticut mirror this trend in North America? The North American Bird Conservation Initiative in 2025, this year, stated that the grassland and arid land bird populations have dropped by 40%. One-third of all species, or 229 species, are at high or moderate conservation concern status. 112 species, including chimney swifts and black rails, are at a tipping point. Waterfowl had shown like really great improvements, and Min will get into this, but they started to decrease by 10%. Some say that as a response of droughts. So think climate change. So since this paper came out, there has been a lot of other research to attribute the causes to these declines, naming cats, both domestic and people who are in feral species, people letting their cats out, or wild cats that just are establishing these colonies. Window collisions, up to 2 billion a year. Pesticides, insecticides, other chemicals, and habitat loss. Excuse me. So will we see these same trends? The one common question was, will there be a book? And what is the end product? So there will not be a book. There will be a website. It's going to have a splash page similar to what we used during the management of the project. There will be lists of all of the species that were encountered, that had been covered by the atlas itself. And one page, for example, this is the northern saw-whet owl. It would have a description of its dispersal, and it would show these bar charts of their seasonal occurrence. This is courtesy of Frank Gallo, who did this work with Greg Hanasek. Furthermore, switching breeds, it covers the breeding data, contrasting what was gathered back in the 80s and what we currently have. And this is going to be of incredible value to people who are doing research. So there's going to be discussion on the statistical models used and some of the stats behind this data. There will be a page that's going to show the breeding phenology, what people reported is like. So if there's confirmed breeding, this is what we saw. So did we see these barred owls with young? Were they feeding young? Were they occupied nests? Were they singing courtship, etc.? So this would be broken down for each species being reported. There'll also be some graphic representation of what some of these breeding codes look like. So you get to see these lovely fledged great horned owls. So we'll also obviously have winter. This is the rare snowy owl, seeing where they occur, and some discussion of why we see ups and downs in snowy owl populations during the winter and why it varies so much. Each species is going to have an analysis by region of how many blocks were reporting it as either confirmed or probable breeding, or if they were seen in the winter. And there's going to be some rarities. So if anybody's wondering when to go out and chase great gray owls, this data could be of great help. So the first stage, we're going to have the block maps and other data. And we're also going to have the text about the species and their dispersal and abundance maps. Part of what the field technicians were doing were some transect surveys to get an idea of abundance. So this is the American redstart. So there will be these temperature graphs that show where most of these species can be found. So the next phase after that will include some of the first records and the rare bird reports, some rare species maps, and data sets coming from non-atlas data. And for phase 3, who knows, expanded history, maybe some maps from the 1950s going into the historical data. So what did we see? With this final data, we were able to track population trends. So this is the State of the Birds report that came out from North American Bird Conservation Initiative. So this 3 billion bird decline that I mentioned earlier is caused by habitat loss in most abundant species. That's to say 5% of the species accounts for 80% of the decline in abundance. This is driven by habitat destruction of forests and grasslands mainly. The common habitats are at maximum carrying capacity. So if there's any destruction in this habitat, you're taking out a lot of birds, individual birds, when you're degrading this habitat. So consider that we are in the past couple of years, our red-winged blackbirds and our grackle numbers are down, and our mallards are somewhat down. So this is a very important report, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but this is showing these habitat groups. Sorry. So when it comes to habitat, I always like to, or feel the need to underscore the fact that our nighttime sky is also habitat for birds. We have 722 bird species in North America. 76% of those migrate. Of those, 80% migrate at night. Connecticut alone has 148 night migrants either flying through or from Connecticut. So when we think habitat, we also have to consider the night sky. So we have up to 2 billion birds killed in bird collisions in North America, and this is related to light pollution. Most birds are passerine woodland nesters. So what's driving some of these other, what were some of the other factors driving this collapse? Land use, obviously, as we start to fragment our forests or start to clear cut certain areas, or as we allow for the desecration of all of our grasslands, either by development or something else, or sometimes our shrublands are just turning into forests and we can't help it. So this land use change is really going to change habitat for a lot of important birds. Obviously, climate change is a huge factor, with more and more storms happening and droughts, lack of winters. This is disrupting phenology for all stages of plants and insects. Fortunately, the climate bill passed this last legislative session, and part of this were nature-based solutions. That is setting up open space for birds. It's not for birds, but it's to allow for storms to go someplace. But it's really contributing habitat that birds are going to be able to use. One important factor is the insects. We've all heard of the insect apocalypse. So remember driving around Connecticut about 15, 20 years ago, what our windshields look like? That's not happening anymore. We're not having these bugs littering our windshields anymore. There's something happening. Entomologists know that climate change and the overall degradation of global habitats are bad news for biodiversity in general, that insects are dealing with the particular challenges posed by herbicides and pesticides, along with the effects of losing meadows, forests, and even weedy patches to the relentless expansion of human spaces. Now, fortunately, we have land trusts and a lot of individuals who are following writers like Doug Ptolemy and are doing something with their plantings and going native and planting oaks and other trees that will host caterpillars. Our forest birds rely on caterpillars. Our aerial insectivores rely on beetles, mosquitoes, and moss. A recent article in Smithsonian states 90% of the more than 10,000 known bird species rely on insects for food during at least part of their life cycle. Losing insects globally at a rate of 1 to 2% annually, according to UConn's David Wagner. This is serious. So a lot of this trend with the insects is directly related to their habitat. So do their trends follow the bird trends and correlates to habitat loss? So what are the birds that we are losing? So the grassland birds, we are being impacted with American kestrel, grasshopper sparrows, and eastern meadowlark. This is really due to the loss of the grasslands within the state. Shrublands, we're seeing something happening here. The brown thrashers just aren't around the way we used to. The blue-winged warbler are really starting to disappear. and ruffed grouse is all but extirpated out of our state. Fortunately, the blue-winged warbler, for example, at Bent of the River, the Audubon Sanctuary, that they're doing a lot of management and territory mapping to see what's the best practices for keeping the species around in the most ideal habitat. Forest fragmentation plays a huge role, and also the loss of intermediate habitat. A lot of our woodland species rely on freshwater marshes to have an intermediate stage where the fledglings will go through a molt, add on fat, and get ready for their migration. But look at these maps from 1980s to where we are now, and notice like the widening gap along the corridors of 95 and 91. So there's something going on sprawling out from these highway corridors. Maybe we could do better as far as land usage there. So also going down for we don't understand the reasons. Kingfishers, we're starting to see their populations drop in the state. Other birds, we're starting to see their populations. Oftentimes, we don't know why. It could be loss of insects, loss of other food sources. There are many causes, and we need a lot more research to get to the bottom of this. But habitat seems to be key. Also, like our Canada warbler, is starting to really disappear out of the state, and only a few blocks where we're seeing it. Other species, you see the decline, brown creepers, purple finch, and once was a very common bird, the chestnut-sided warbler. We're not seeing that in our area much anymore. But what about some of the more common ones? These are obviously starlings having pizza down in New York City. But even their populations are starting to contract. We don't see the breeding that we used to, like pigeons. They're on the decline. We're seeing some blocks blanking out as far as even house sparrows and our house finches. So something serious is going on here. So some of the other reasons where this could happen, this is not so much in our state, but obviously overkill, which would be from hunting, pollution, like for example, pollution, the DDT impacted our falcon population and extirpated it out of the state. At one point, there was hunting of these falcons as well. So those two things are not a factor, and we're starting to see these falcons coming back within the state and nesting in certain areas. But oddly enough, here they seem to be nesting along the 91, 95 corridors. Perhaps they're taking advantage of the bridges and nesting there. Screech owls. One could be that there was not enough effort to go into the habitat to record screech owls. In my research on light pollution, I came across facts that light pollution, as we have a garage light shining into our surrounding woods, could actually force a screech owl to give up its territory and find a better location. So light pollution is impacting our nocturnal nesters. Bank swallows, really not sure, but here again, that's directly linked to decline in our insects. Chimney swifts, even something that was very common, like our eastern kingbird. So what are we gaining? It's not all losers, it's not all bad news. This trend continues, like we're seeing more of these Carolina wrens coming into the state, black vultures. It just was not seen in the 80s atlas, and we're starting to see nesting populations in some sort of abundance and regularity. Also, pine warblers are really doing quite well. Another highly successful bird that's moved in was the red-bellied woodpecker. Also doing well. Really look at this along the coast, and this is due because of the Connecticut Audubon's huge effort to put nesting platforms in for ospreys. Eagles are coming back. This is probably due in large part because of the DDT ban. Ravens are moving in. I'm not sure why. But look at this population during winter for our eagles. Back in 1979, 20 eagles were counted in the state. Now we have 185 in 2023. So that's definitely good news. Turkeys have come back. Fish crows are becoming quite prominent. Cooper's hawk. Is this because more and more people are feeding birds in their backyards and Cooper's hawks are coming in to take advantage of that? Yellow-bellied sapsuckers really have expanded out of Litchfield County. Pileated woodpeckers. Is this because we have aging woods and the trees are hosting more carpenter ants? Are hooded mergansers doing better? This is our common merganser. Blue-gray gnatcatchers are doing a lot better as well. And oyster catchers. This is probably in large part because of some efforts of the two Audubons in their shorebird protection efforts. And we're starting to see more common eiders. So at this point, I would like to turn things over to Min to carry on from here.
Well, hey, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Craig, for starting us off. If you could stop sharing, there we go. I will see if I can figure out how to bring up my part. There. Okay. So are you guys seeing this? And am I advancing slides? I am, correct?
Yes, you are. Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so good evening, everyone. And thanks again, Craig, for laying out, some of the things that I think we all figured we were going to see with the Atlas when we envisioned doing this back in, I guess it was 2016 or so. So yeah, as Craig was saying, we've had some increases, but we certainly have had some declines and really some alarming trends. Some of our species, well, let's say rough grouse, we've lost like 95% of our breeding population. Some of these others that, Craig was showing, in the 60s and 70% decline in the last 40 years in the breeding distribution. And so, given that, you've seen this slide, we had two main objectives when we started off with the Atlas. And one was certainly to compile and analyze contemporary data on the distribution of our breeding birds and also our wintering birds. But we knew that in doing so, we were going to have to really get a whole bunch of people, and we had over 1,000 people contribute data to the Atlas. So we felt that if we could get, the conservation community, the birders together to unite and work hard to get the Atlas done, that we would hopefully be able to take some of that momentum and, put it into the second main objective that we had, which we really thought was the most important objective, which was to really try to develop a stable funding mechanism to address what we knew we were going to find in doing the Atlas. And so that's kind of where we are right now. So Craig kind of talked about it. There's a whole bunch of different causes for declines. Some of them are under our control to some extent, and some of them certainly are not. And so, one of the biggest things that we can really affect is habitat, whether it's here on the breeding grounds or, in Connecticut, we also our stopover habitat, both north and south for species that are breeding further north of us. And then, there are mechanisms where we can actually affect habitat on the wintering grounds for a lot of our species. But we affect productivity and survival if we don't have good habitat on the breeding grounds. And if we don't have good habitat on the wintering grounds, then we can send down a bunch of birds, but they're not going to either make it back or with these cross-seasonal effects, they're not going to get the nutrition they need to be fat enough that when they make it back to the breeding grounds to produce eggs. There's a bunch of species on the waterfowl side that accumulate all their resources and nutrients for breeding on the wintering grounds. And then as soon as they get to the breeding grounds, then they start laying eggs. And then, of course, there are contaminants, climate change, whether we're going to be able to do anything about that. And hunting. Craig had a slide about hunting. Folks don't understand that a lot of our shorebirds are actually hunted on the wintering grounds in the Caribbean. And so, Yellowlegs are one species that get hunted quite heavily in the Caribbean. So if we can affect some of that and try to reduce some of that ancillary mortality, then we're doing a good part and a good thing there. Predation. I think Craig had that slide where you look at the number of birds that are taken every single year by outdoor cats. Those are things that are within our control to try to lessen some of that additive mortality. Craig talked again about building strikes. I just reiterate that these are again estimates. We have really no good idea of how large the magnitude is. These are minimum estimates. I love this slide for one reason. This is one night in a skyscraper in Toronto. That's a whole lot of birds. Most of the mortality from bird strikes, though, really occurs in structures that are 5 stories or less. A lot of them around our houses. So again, those are things that we can affect at home and at the local scale to try to reduce some of this ancillary mortality. We've seen this slide before, but again, this is really, really critical to understand that there's a lot of hazards out there for birds, and some of these again are within our control, others are not. So we should really be trying to concentrate on those things that are within our purview to change, so that we can again try to move the needle in the right direction. And we heard about this earlier. So when we're doing our conservation thinking, we're really thinking about the life cycle of these birds, right? They migrate, and that's the biggest thing. We have to protect habitat along each step of the way. So breeding grounds, migration areas, and then the wintering grounds. And we really need to figure out with these declines. We've showed a bunch of them. Is what exactly is the root cause of the decline, right? We can point to habitat loss for quite a few of them. In some instances, we can point to disturbance, whether either it's during the breeding cycle or the wintering, that is impacting the fitness of those birds. And you can see some of these other examples. But once we can actually identify those factors that are affecting bird populations, then we can actually take steps to try to mitigate for those. And again, I'd love to say that habitat is the key to wildlife, because it truly is. Without habitat, we don't have critters. And again, habitat is something that we can positively affect, given the resources and also given, the urgency, I guess, the dedication, because it does take work. So in the absence of habitat, we can't sustain populations, and we lose habitat through a bunch of different mechanisms, right? Talked about outright loss, whether it's conversion or succession, degradation of wetlands, for instance. We spend a lot of time doing, work in coastal wetlands to try to restore degraded and enhance degraded wetlands. With humans and some of the maps that we will be seeing in the next couple of weeks when all this data comes live, really do show that, fragmentation and development are really, really affecting the distribution of our breeding birds. And that really, seems to make sense when you think about it. So what do we do? Well, we can protect habitat as much as we possibly can. We can enhance degraded habitats, and we have to really actively manage habitats as well. So some of the first examples you saw of declines were of grassland species and shrubland species. Well, grasslands, if we have a reasonable grassland, we have to maintain that grassland every year, or succession is going to turn it into a shrubland. And then if we want a shrubland, but we don't maintain that over a 10 to 15 to 20 year window, then it becomes young forest, and we lose those species that are relying upon those habitats. So really, depending on your priority and your objectives, if you have the habitat, then you got to actually actively manage it in many instances. And that again takes time, money, and capacity in people. So what we feel like we've done with this atlas is we've given all of us a contemporary look at what our birds, where our birds are, and where the range has shrunk or the range has expanded. We also, for the first time, will have population estimates for many of our non-hunted species. So annually, I could give you population estimates for all the species that we hunt, but we don't have those for non-hunted species, except for those that are endangered. For most of the endangered ones, we actually do have annual counts. But the data we gathered in this atlas is going to actually give us, for the first time, population estimates of a lot of our other breeding species, which is really, really important. But the real thing is that, we've come up with all this data and the status of all these species. We have an inkling as to what's causing some of these declines. We don't for others. But, if we are going to do anything with these data, we need the resources to do it. And that's really where that bottom bullet comes in now, is that now the real work, as if 4 years of going out in nice weather, crummy weather weren't enough. Now really the true work has to begin if we're going to use the data that we collected to effective use. You've seen this slide before. If you look at it, the waterfowl species are the ones, and the water birds, that are really doing well. Everybody else is tanking, and it's a fairly easy reason why. And funding, and with funding comes political power, and having the advocates that can make the differences in Washington, D.C. on big pieces of legislation that affect hundreds of millions of acres. And waterfowl have those. And that came about back in the early 80s. Actually, at the same time we were doing our first atlas. At that time, the prairies were going dry. They're in the middle of a very, very bad drought, and hunters were worried. And they lobbied Congress in Washington, D.C. to develop what's called the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, NAWAMP. That is single-handedly one of the most successful conservation programs in the world. Since 1986, NAWAMP has raised and leveraged billions of dollars for habitat protection in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And we see the results. Waterfowl species, by and large, are doing well. And with that come a lot of the wetland-dependent species that are benefiting from protection of wetlands and protection of surrounding uplands. And so if you have the resources, you can make a difference. What is the common denominator in all the things that you see below the Mendoza line here? Is that they don't have the funding nor the advocacy yet. So some of the things that we can do at a small scale, because again, conservation starts at the local level, right? In your backyards, and then it can scale up to things that are more grand. But, just around our homes, very simple things we can do, right? Craig's program, Lights Out. Very easy to treat windows and to, try to use good lighting practices, not only for the birds, but for part of the food chain, our insects. Some pretty easy thing to know. Let's not use chemicals around the house, things of that nature. If you want to bump up to your municipal, your town level, or a regional level, join a land trust. I mean, those land trusts in our state are doing fantastic work. Scoffing up habitat, managing habitat they own. They're doing a great job. There's a lot of active ones across the state. So, please look into that and be an advocate for just everything natural world. And that's why we're having this talk tonight, and why we're going on the road with a bunch of other talks, is that we're asking folks to become an advocate. We can then bump up, to a bigger level. And that's part of what we're kind of getting at today is, we have to find a way to have adequate funding that is reliable, so we can actually do the things that we need to do for most of these species that are not doing well, if we care about our birds. One of the things with the land trusts and how, they work with the state and other NGO partners is to look on the landscape and try to protect large tracts of contiguous habitat that are connected. This is an example here. This is down in Ledyard in the southeastern part of the state, where we've got multiple entities looking at the same map and trying to protect these huge green corridors so that we can maintain connectivity between habitats, and also, particularly along the coast, maintain intact forest, because, Connecticut is a jumping off point for a lot of our land birds as they head south. So moving forward, please, everyone, continue to do what you're doing, partner, and try to conserve habitat. But really, what we need is to find financial resources that are stable, that we can use for habitat protection, habitat manipulation, those types of things to maintain everything that our birds need on the landscape. And also, to ship money where it might be needed if, we know that that's a limiting factor. And so, as an example, our Connecticut migratory bird stamp, everyone should be buying one of those every year, by the way. They're only $17. All of that money goes straight to wetland preservation here in Connecticut. We've protected and spent over $7 million just in Connecticut from sales of that stamp. But we send $15,000 a year of that money up to Canada. We work with Ducks Unlimited and fund projects up there that are protecting habitat, because we know that some of our birds breed in Canada. And so why wouldn't we try to protect some of those habitats? There's also organizations such as Southern Wings that if we actually had the funds, we would be probably giving money to them. They do a lot of advocacy and work down in South America. And so they have contacts down there where they're protecting habitat from logging and grazing, and doing active work down there to protect habitat for our neotropical migrants. So if we were to have a stable funding source, here's some of the things that we think we could do. We could certainly buy a lot of habitat, right? And we could be using that to maintain our existing habitats if we want, for instance, grasslands to be maintained, shrublands, those types of things. And also, start digging deeper into some of the factors that are responsible for some of the declines that we saw. When you gather more data, all it does, it'll answer some questions, but then it usually brings up new questions. Just a couple of examples that I'm just going to go through right now of some of the other things that could be done if we had stable funds. I'll bring up the American kestrel, great example. This is a species that, because of 4, 5, 6 people across the state who have volunteered their time and blood and sweat, we were able to upgrade them from threatened 15 years ago to now special concern. Based upon all the work of our volunteers, these 5 to 6 people across the state, we know that it takes approximately $2,600 to fledge a kestrel. And so if we had money to help fund all of this work, because again, these folks they're not getting any younger, we could probably spend $250,000 over the next few years and completely delist the American kestrel. Another example is the piping plover. Given all the work that we do with Audubons, and really Audubons do the lion's share of the work with our shorebirds, it costs almost $1,500 to grow one plover chick. Again, we have to fence all the nests. We have to patrol the beaches to keep the dogs off them, so on and so forth. So given that we're about 600 to 700 adults short of the goal for the Atlantic coast population, you can see the number there that it might take if we had the funds to really double down and protect nesting birds. And, unfortunately, in our state, the list goes on of endangered and threatened species. And, in the absence of real resources to do real good, the list is going to grow. And, the really unfortunate thing, I think, for me anyway, is that, a lot of our common species are becoming uncommon. And Craig showed a slide. He went through it a little quickly, but, the starlings, the house sparrows, and, those are species that are generalists in the greatest definition of generalists. Usually when we lose species, whether they're birds, invertebrates, mammals, what have you, they're called what we call habitat specialists, right? So they're really, really keyed in on a specific habitat type. But man, we're losing generalists, which really means, that to me is a huge red flag. There's something bad going on out there in our environment where it's the generalists and also many of our specialists that are declining, and that should concern us all. So, the future for us, we are likely at a tipping point, it seems, for many of the things, not just birds, in our natural world, but, the birds are really, the old adage, the canary in the coal mine. So the birds are telling us that things are really, really not good. And unfortunately, it is really, really clear that the things we're doing now, as hard as we work, and as good as the things we're doing, it's not even close to being good enough. We neglected to mention numbers, but 62% of our breeding species are declining. And that's from, the reference point of the mid 80s. 29% are increasing, which, okay, that's okay, but 62% are declining. And the Atlas showed that we had 6% new species breeding here. That's climate change. We have southern species coming up. But clearly, what we're doing is not enough. And what we are advocating for is for the conservation community to come together, not just the birders, for all of us who care, to really come together, put our heads together, and come up with the best way to develop meaningful legislation at the state level that would give us the resources that we need. And it's not the state, it's all of us that we need to reverse the trend. So the hunters, they've had that since 1937. When are we going to get something like that for our non-game species, our non-hunted species? It's been 88 years. I think that's the correct math. Yes, 1937 to now. And how much longer are we gonna wait before we do something? So the clock is really ticking. And we're almost here at midnight. And once we hit midnight, good night. A lot of our stuff will be gone forever. And so we're really hoping that folks will really, once the Atlas data is released, they can go on the website, take a look at all the stuff, and come to the same realization, excuse me, that we are, that time has come for us to get together and do something. And the one thing that we really can do is affect habitat. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that are affecting birds that we probably really can't address at the scale that we need to, but habitat is certainly one of those that we can. And so with that, we want to thank you very much. And you've got our time now. So let's, if you guys have questions, comments, we'd love to hear them. And I will stop sharing. And yeah, there we go.
Thanks, guys. Anybody have a question? Raise your hand, call on you, and you can go off mute and ask.
Well, I have a question about the land trusts, which seem like there are a lot of land holdings by the land trusts all across Connecticut, and it would be a really good source of habitat to protect. I don't know if there's any kind of organized effort to work with them, or you're just doing this in different locations, or if that's working. But that seems to me to have a lot of potential.
Sure. Yeah, I'll take that one for now. Yeah, we work very, very closely with the land trusts in the state. So we have a number of programs. One of them is the open space program, right, where we're awarding a lot of money to land trusts to try to protect as much habitat as possible. And our land trusts, raise a lot of money privately as well. We've also helped them with a bunch of North American Wetland Conservation Act grants to help them get money to buy more. So yeah, the land trusts are fantastic. And ultimately, we would like to see them at the forefront of habitat conservation if they had the funding. So again, our open space program is funded by the legislature, and every few years got to go up and beg for more. But it does go to a good purpose. But if we had more, we could certainly do a better job.
Great. I
Robin.
guess, Mike, can I just add to that? I've frustratingly found out that land trusts aren't necessarily conservation organizations. I mean, they have land, but I've been told by some local land trusts that it's multi-use, meaning dog walking and all other kinds of activities. I don't know if you have those kinds of conversations about what conservation of these lands really means.
Yeah, so some certainly do are for multi-use, and there's nothing wrong with multi-use, right? Depending particularly upon your ultimate objectives. But there's a number of those land trusts where they are actively managing land and they have large holdings. So, for instance, let's say a land trust has a little 10-acre parcel. In the grand scheme of things, that's probably not great bird habitat for most of our species. For some, it may be. And that piece relative to, let's say, a 200-acre piece, they're both important, but the larger chunk is certainly probably more important in the long run. And so
Also, if I could add,
Sure.
to add about land trust, I'm on a land trust board here in Hamden, Connecticut, and um, it's all based on volunteers. And unfortunately, land trust, like any other organization right now, is very thin on volunteers and people having enough time to go out and do the things like removal of invasives. So at one point we have discussions on, do we have to hire somebody to come in and take care of mugwort on a certain property? So proper funding could address this issue, being overextended on a volunteer basis and getting some paid personnel in to do this type of work. So yeah, it kind of boils down to funding. So Robin, you have a question?
No, I have a comment. Just because we're doing some stuff with land trusts as well. So Gina, hey, Robin from Bent to the River Audubon Center, and luckily there are consortia of land trusts throughout the state. There's also the large CLCC, the Connecticut Land Conservation Council, that has the wonderful conference every March that is worth going to, because things like habitat conservation and land conservation are discussed at those conferences. Also, the Housatonic Valley Association, which is very active in northwestern Connecticut, has a wonderful initiative which is called Follow the Forest. And Follow the Forest, while it right now works mainly on linkages for terrestrial creatures between large forest tracts, with the goal of basically suggesting to land trusts where prime linkage property exists, so that if that property comes available, that would be high priority for purchase because it has high value as a forest connector. And then Audubon is going to be working with Audubon, Connecticut, New York. We're going to be rolling out at some point a wood thrush habitat improvement training for land trusts. And wood thrush are going to be used, of course, as an umbrella species for this. And we're still finalizing details on what that is going to look like, but it's a little teaser for right now that we are looking at habitat assessments, demonstration plots, et cetera, and training land trust staff and volunteers, land stewards, et cetera, in better practices for forest birds. And then, of course, the Bent does a lot with early successional. So that's just a comment on land trusts.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. That was great. I would also add, when it comes to land acquisition, that most private landowners would rather deal with a land trust than the state. Many folks who are trying to unload land or, that type of thing would much rather not deal with the state. And that's just a fact. And so again, the land trusts in our state do wonderful work. And I believe that the future of conservation, at least from the habitat acquisition side, probably lies better with the land trust than it does the state of Connecticut. So,
I just want to make a comment about the 10 acres that you mentioned, Min. You got 10 acres here, but another 10 acres, and then another 10 acres, and then another 10 acres. Pretty soon you got 200 acres.
oops.
And
Yeah.
if you're looking at making them contiguous, so much the better.
Yes, no. So my point being with that reference to a 10-acre piece was going back, and I didn't tie it back, unfortunately, was going back to multiple use. So for instance, if a land trust conservation holding area is going to allow multiple use and like dogs and things of that nature on a 10-acre piece, way better than on a 200-acre piece, was really kind of getting it at that. And that's why I said, ooh,
If you're gonna have dog walking, have it on the 10-acre piece.
Correct. And again, the further point that some of the land trusts across the state, I forget how many we have, but it's triple digits, I believe. All they may have is 10 acres. And as part of that, they want people to be able to go out and enjoy the land. And so you see a lot of them that might be using multiple use. So I guess as a teaser or not, some of the things that we have been kicking around, our Atlas team, are, a very similar thing to what the hunters do. So the hunters, they pay an 11% tax on every firearm, every bullet they buy. And, a user pays system of conservation is the North American model for conservation. It has worked. It continues to work. And so one of the things that we've been kicking around is, and I think you've probably heard some of us talk about this here and there over the last decade, is a birdseed tax. And if we had a 10% birdseed tax in this state, we feel from a conservative estimate that we're looking at between $13 to $15 million a year, given all the amount of birdseed that is purchased. To put that into context, currently we are getting $7 million a year from the sales of firearms and ammunition and other hunting implements through the Pittman-Robertson Act. And so this could be a huge amount of annual stable money if there was a stomach for it, and if there were enough people to champion it, because again, the state could never go to the legislature and ask for a tax. The people have to do it. There are 12 or 13 states in this great country that actually have dedicated sources of revenue for non-hunted species. I just don't see why a very affluent state like us couldn't be the next one. But again, there are a whole bunch of things that have to come into play if anything like this were to come about. And a big thing is finding the right legislators to back it and writing the right bill. But anyways, that's kind of where our thoughts have. We've been having some discussions with various folks who we feel are fairly influential, and so far they're pretty interested. And so I think hopefully over the next year or two, we will have a much better fleshed out strategy that people can really attach themselves to if they're so willing.
Any final questions? All right. Min and Craig, thank you so much for this look at the Atlas and what went into making it and the unfortunate results. But let's do something about it.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for having us. And I'll just add that we are hoping to have the Atlas website live in the next couple weeks. When we do, the word will go out through a press release at Deep, but then through like the birding listserv and a whole bunch of other places, so that everybody knows that it's out there and can peruse it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Hey, have a great night, everyone.